Lisa,
Yes, baby girl.
when I grow up, I want to be a womanist to society.
Then so shall you be. Hey, this is Lisa Landry. Welcome back to One Menace to Society. I'm so excited to speak with today's guest. He is an MS and an LPC. Please welcome to the podcast, Jon Uhler.
Well, Lisa, thank you. It's a privilege to be with you.
It's a privilege to speak with you. Can you please tell me what is an MS?
Well, that's an excellent question. That's just a Master's of Science. That's my master's degree. And then LPC is Licensed Professional Counselor.
So, how do you go from having a background in science to getting into counseling?
Yeah, well, that's actually was sort of reversed. My background, once upon a time, I was actually heading into vocational Christian ministry after finding out I could not fly for the Marines because of issue of glasses back then. And then found myself heading into the ministry and then doing youth ministry for a while, but then kind of getting burned out a little bit with programs, and then also discovered that I had maybe a gifting in counseling, and that was an interest of mine. So I made a shift from vocational ministry into counseling, and then went from a Christian college setting for studying counseling, actually at a seminary, to a state school out in Southern California, Cal State Fullerton. So I finished up with a master's in counseling back in the early 90s and was working inpatient, outpatient. That's when I started working pretty extensively with survivors, though I didn't know really anything about sexual abuse at the time. So I kind of learned the hard way, which was in walking with folks through that journey. That was very eye-opening for me because, fortunately, that was not my background. But as a result of that, I didn't know. I didn't know the extent to which some people will hurt kids, even in a very sadistic way. So that was very, very eye-opening for me. That was also my introduction to really what's called trauma-based disorders, what happens when the inside of someone, as far as their soul and their psyche and their inner world, is assaulted like that. So that became a specialty of mine. Then started working with kids in the system and worked in a variety of settings. Then had an opportunity to start a behavioral health services referral network for employee assistance programs. So that was in the professional business realm, and then had a very unique opportunity to head up a children and youth services, or Department of Children and Family Services, for a county out in Pennsylvania. So I went from California to Pennsylvania and then was recruited to the Department of Corrections out in Pennsylvania. So I was as far as I know or knew at the time, the only person with a regular counseling background that was actually on psychology staff, because most psychology staff in prisons have more of a science type of background. So I kind of came to this from a reverse angle.
That's sometimes better, though, isn't it? Because you're coming in with an open mind, sort of.
Yeah. But it was quite something to end up being there for 11 years in the Department of Corrections, having been steeped in a world of working with survivors, to suddenly working with those that had been the cause of survivors. So that I had to go through my own processing a lot with that. And from that, after retiring, started originally what was called Church Protect. That's actually still in existence. That's churchprotect.org. We, myself and a founding partner at that time, felt very strongly that some of the most sophisticated predators would actually target churches. Australia did an extensive study as a result of a national awareness of abuse, and they found what we knew to be true, which was over half of sophisticated predators target some aspect of churches or church involvement for a number of reasons. And so Church Protect was born to try to help churches become aware of, and church leadership, that they have wolves among the sheep.
I wanted to stop you just for one second, because that blows my mind when you think of how many child sexual predators there are
That's
out
right.
there, and you consider that, like you just said, half of these people who already have propensities are hiding out in churches and mosques
That's
and
right.
temples. That's an amazing number.
That's right, and you can see the confusion for so many people, so many survivors, that it seems like the least safe place is church, and it's filled with hypocrites. So that's the greatest challenge right there, number one. I think because there's people there. But number two, if in fact that becomes twice as likely to be targeted by the most sophisticated of child predators, then that means that the majority of people who have been perpetrated upon probably were perpetrated upon within a religious context. And so as a result of that, unfortunately, most survivors, though understandably, then want nothing to do with quote-unquote religion, because their own experience was that's where they were hunted. And that's the one place that is the least likely place that they will be believed. And as a matter of fact, that's the reason why survivorsupport.net now was created, because I wanted to ensure, though we can shine the light on the cockroaches in churches, that's what Church Protect does, but as I finish with trainings, for instance, I really want people to understand not so much about the cockroaches, not so much about the predators, though that's extremely important, but I also want them to understand that right in their midst, they have very, very wounded people that are suffering in silence, because those survivors do not feel that they will be believed. They do not feel like they will be supported. And unfortunately, typically they're correct. And so survivor support has been created to really help survivors as an adjunct to their therapy, but also to help educate people on how best to support survivors.
I really enjoy your website, survivorsupport.net, and you have a blog there. And as you're referencing these atrocities that happen in spiritual venues, I'm reminded of a blog that you wrote about satanic ritual abuse and those victims. Can you tell my listeners and me more about SRA?
Sure. It's something that I didn't know about. It's something that I had never heard of, not only through my quote-unquote religious education, but certainly through grad school. As a matter of fact, I didn't have any courses on dealing with trauma and trauma with respect to what happens when somebody is sexually abused. So it's sad that I really do think the majority of counselors heading into the field, they don't know. Then on top of that, you add to that whole issue of sexual abuse to what we all think in terms of, or the average person, if you talk in terms of sexual abuse, they won't imagine that there really is a thinking in terms of a continuum, so kind of the bell-shaped curve. If you ask an average person, what's the worst thing someone can do to a kid, they would probably come up with what really I consider to be average, but there's nothing average about it, average sexual abuse. We don't think in terms of that there are people out there that are very much like Nazis, that are very much driven by sadistic inclinations. And then on top of it, in the most extreme, they have a religious bent that is very much, there's no other way to put it, satanic, meaning they themselves ascribe to, though they would never verbalize it, of course, because you don't advertise that you're abusing a kid. But there is, in the most extreme cases, a religious bent that is very, very dark. And for the most heinous of situations, you have people that will use kids in religious rituals, which inevitably take the form of, in one way or another, very dark and or satanic activities. And so that's what's called satanic ritual abuse, where it's bad enough to harm a child. It's bad enough then to traumatize a child. But then if you add this religious component on top of it, and then if you purposely are practicing very dark, if not satanic things, almost sometimes like you see in movies, that will be enough to do a real number on a child that they will spend the rest of their life getting over, as you can imagine.
How widespread do you think this kind of abuse is, though? Because I remember I grew up in the church, and I never had an issue with any spiritual leader myself personally. I guess I'm lucky. Now that you tell me the stats,
Yeah.
you know, I remember the Satanic Panic. I remember friends of mine had to get rid of their He-Man toys because their parents
Oh,
decided
yeah,
that they were.
yeah.
You remember when that was going on, and people
Hmm.
throwing out their their Disney videotapes back then. We had videotapes, VCR tapes,
Right, right.
and all that kind of stuff. And I think people might not think that this is still a thing because it was kind of
Hmm.
denounced, wasn't it?
Right. And, it's subjective because how are you going to get the real stats about this? Do I think there's a worldwide conspiracy where you have the equivalent of Rosemary's Baby? Good people differ on this that I am aware of. For myself, I personally don't think, although I do think there are forces arrayed around the world that communicate with each other just in general as far as everything on a macro level,
Mm-hmm.
economically and those things. But in terms of abusing kids, I do think there are groups that are very coordinated in human trafficking, in trafficking kids. But then there's also a part that is of this religious bent. And I don't know how many are out there, but I do know, I'm convinced that these groups exist and they are very smart and they're sadistic and they're evil. The average person can't comprehend it because why would you do this exactly? But if somebody's mind starts to become very, very dark, we call that a psychopath. But there are two types of psychopaths, by the way. It doesn't have to just be the bloody psychopath, but Robert Hare is sort of the grandfather of psychopathy. He calls them white-collar psychopaths. And a psychopath simply is this. It's someone without a conscience.
Mm-hmm.
If you have no conscience, you have no empathy, and therefore you have no remorse. So whether and this is not a political statement, but whether in the White House, penthouse, or outhouse, you can be a psychopath. As a matter of fact, I'm convinced in the majority of people's families, they have someone that is a psychopath. We don't call them that.
I'd agree with that.
Right? It's just a person that speaks their mind. They don't care who they hurt, and it's the person that never apologizes. Right, so that's kind of the human propensity anyways. But then if you start to get more into self, and then you add to that some very deviant stuff in terms of sexuality, that'll begin to take you down a path or take a person down a path where it moves from just lust and deviance into an increasing desire for perpetrating pain. Then you move from that, if you move from that into or adding to it a religious bent, now it's a whole different ballgame. And then if you move from there into dark religious stuff, now it will add even an additional layer. So I don't think there's millions and millions of these people. I do think there are certain people that are into this that are very smart. And why are they into it? Because they become evil. And they find other like-minded people who have different positions, literally, different types of jobs. And so these are very sophisticated pedophiles who communicate on the dark web. I have heard that only about 3%, maybe it's not even that, of the regular internet use that we all use, that's what we're familiar with as far as the internet, that's only about 3%. Apparently, the vast majority of the internet is like an iceberg. It's all underwater. I've never accessed the dark web. I wouldn't even know how, but I'll tell you what, that's where all the child trafficking takes place. And so on top of the regular kind of child trafficking, as heinous as that is, there are people that are driven by religious inclinations and very dark spiritual forces to perpetrate upon kids, and they do so with a lot of religious trappings. And I think these certain select groups do communicate with each other, how much, but they certainly communicate within themselves, and so they'll find people. Let me give you an example. The first client that I worked with, I came to discover that her stepfather, her mother also facilitated this, but her stepfather was the primary perpetrator. But then the mother's dad, he turned out to be a security guard at a couple of different places. One was a cemetery.
Ooh.
Then there was also a doctor. There was a dentist. There was a school teacher at the elementary school. Then there was a pastor. There was a Sunday school bus driver. And there were probably a couple of others. I think that, unfortunately, thinking in terms of that world or those people that would do that, I think that's pretty typical, because what that means is you can not just harm a child, but harm them on an ongoing basis in a regular way, involving them in on things, including, I think she was forced as a child to see murders. I believe that. That sends a pretty strong message to a child to keep quiet. But then they had access to things, including, I believe, body parts.
From
So
the cemetery?
they could then facilitate these rituals. And then also, if the child got sick, well, there was a physician that was a part of this. So you never had to go outside that circle, and then the child could never be free. So when she went to elementary school, guess who was watching her? And they had ways of letting her know they were watching her, including use of different objects, or in their particular case, they all had a certain type of ring made. And so you can control a person pretty well if you have connected in their mind a certain ring or certain something they're wearing. All you have to do is sort of, let's say, twist that ring. You don't have to be near that person. You now have jogged their memory, shall we say. But as that type of trauma is going on, what's happening, and these perpetrators know it, the child's personality is becoming split. There used to be a term, multiple personality. It's now changed.
Yeah, what do we call it now?
What
do we call it now?
Well, we call it now dissociative identity disorder. Yeah, there's different reasons why they keep changing the title, but the phenomenon is exactly the same. And you're talking to a guy that never believed this once upon a time, didn't believe in that phenomenon. I used to sort of make light of it, and that was when I first was entering the field, because I didn't have a course on it. I didn't believe it. I just didn't have the context, so because it sounded so bizarre, and I thought it was very rare. I don't think it's rare. The easiest way to describe it, though, is that our personality is really very much like an array of, you take a new crayon box, 64 Crayola crayons, and within our personality we have emotions, and those that are more orderly, they keep their crayons in the same order as they get that box. But there's a complete array of aspects to our personality. But if things start to happen to us that are way more than a child can handle, we understand that in adulthood. We call it PTSD. When something happens, an event, an incident happens that's too much to process, think about first responders. They will compartmentalize those things. In the worst case scenario, we call that amnesia. But the question is, where did that memory go? And just because somebody can't remember it, the question is, A, did it happen? Yes. B, did it have an effect? Well, strangely enough, I can compartmentalize, and it's all involuntary, without realizing it. For sanity's sake, I have compartmentalized the memory, but a part of me sure feels the feelings. And we call that, or I call that, the delayed effect of that is a panic disorder. So when someone's having a panic attack, what they really are doing is they are experiencing something that doesn't make sense, but on some level, I'll tell you what, it makes perfect sense, because they've just connected, though not intellectually. They've connected with something that now reminds them, but they can't put their finger on it. But that flood of intensity, what they're really feeling is adrenaline. All the heart palpitations, the ringing in the ears, the narrowing of the vision, tunnel vision, it feels like they're going to die. They're going to get, just like someone, if you're swimming in the water, you see a shark fin coming at you. That's why they have to get out of Walmart and they leave all their groceries behind. They can't figure out what just happened. But the good news is this: something did just happen. And if they can begin to connect that in my mind is the answer to panic attacks and panic disorder. There is something. So the good news is they don't have to live with this nebulous thing. But thinking in terms of if something happened as a child, as powerful as that example is for an adult, let's say somebody coming out of combat or a first responder, how much more for a child whose brain is not developed, who already has a hard time processing adult things. But then if something happens to them that is sadistic and then of a sexual assault nature in a repeated way, it's one thing for a kid to go through a snatch and grab experience and then be sexually assaulted. But can you imagine what it's like for someone that you know and that you can't get away, literally and figuratively, 4 years, and it goes on? Because there are certain sadistic people that will hurt children like that week in and week out for years. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about ritualistic abuse. That term actually has become well established within the field. As a matter of fact, my license is from Pennsylvania, and in the child abuse training that everybody's mandated to take if you deal with kids, they now will reference ritual abuse. So that's without the religious component, but you add them on top of it, a religious component. It's all the more, because what happens is that child, because of the trauma on the inside, that normal personality then starts to become segmented. So if you take, for instance, a sausage and you cut that sausage up into little tiny pieces, that's a pretty good description of what happens with somebody's personality. And then using that Crayola-crayon analogy, we're designed with a full array of emotions. But if a personality starts to become segmented like that, it's almost like if each of those Crayola crayons could begin to have a voice. They're not working together. It's not like a rainbow. Now it's a segmented rainbow. And so people that have been traumatized, but kids that have gone through abuse without realizing it. But the perpetrators know how to do this because they can create, as it were, enough trauma to where the personality splits off. So the one that is kind of the core person, as we talk about, the core person is the one to be protected on the inside. And so the perpetrators know how to cause that personality to split. So they create enough trauma where the conscious person, as it were, the little child, goes away. We kind of say, you know what, this ain't happening to me, I'm out of here. Well, the question is, does the child pass out? The child doesn't pass out. The child's eyes are still open, still communicating. But if the child sort of went away, then who is there? There's now another part of their personality that's come out to take the abuse, but they also take with that, when the abuse stops, when that segment of time stops, they take the intensity and they take the memory and they get tucked away and the core person comes back. So you begin to have then the start of the phenomenon of, because that'll go on then for many times and many years often. So you'll have that phenomenon start and you can see how many times that might segment. But then what you have as that child becomes a teenager and then eventually adult, they've lived with it for so long, but now the abuse has stopped because they moved away from the perpetrator. But that phenomenon not only took place, so it's on the inside of them, but now as an adult, they're having to deal with ongoing issues of life. But that propensity to go away, as it were, and another part come out when stress happens, when they encounter jerks, when they encounter threats. Mm-hmm. That's going on all the time. So somebody that experiences that usually has very difficult time in relationships, or in relationship. Relationships are always challenging for any of us, but you can imagine then if a part of the person is kind of going away and they don't remember, and then they come back. How do you maintain a relationship like that? How do you be a parent like that? How do you remain employed, especially when you have to-do lists, when you have tasks that need to be done? And then on top of it, those segmented parts will still have a voice. And so they will actually hear voices, but because of the current day culture in psychology and psychiatry, the most feared question, but the most typical question a psychiatrist will ask, a psychiatrist is an MD, is, do you hear voices? Well, if what that means is I'm going to be labeled as crazy or psychotic, do you really think I'm going to admit to that? So, unfortunately, a lot of these folks, these survivors, don't get the help they need because they can't talk about this. They feel crazy. They don't know there's about 5 different reasons for hearing voices. And so they have a professional just ask, do you hear voices? they're typically going to say no, and they don't want to hear voices. So they continue to tell themselves that, I mean, they're internally at war with themselves.
Right.
And so they fight against that which really does need to happen, which is if they're ever going to begin to get help and be helped and start healing, they actually have to start right there, which is to begin to risk believing that, you know what, the thing that I've been trying to push away, meaning starting with the voices, I need to actually risk believing that this is not my mind or my imagination, meaning it's real, but it doesn't make me crazy, because crazy people don't fear being crazy. So if any of your listeners have feared this to be true, the good news is they're not crazy. It makes them very normal.
You know,
but
it's really
right?
Yeah, no,
It does
I
mean,
used to have a joke like that actually in my set about the only people who never stop and ask if they're crazy are the ones who are out of their minds.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. As a matter of fact, a crazy person will tell you about the voices. So if somebody listening right now experiences that phenomenon, they've never talked to anybody, the good news is they're not crazy.
Mm-hmm.
The bad news is until they do deal with that, they're always going to be dealing with it, because what it means is a part of them is trying to speak truth, and they've been trying to shut that down. And so the easiest way to view that phenomenon is simply somebody who has been hurt, that a part of them needs to know something. And if I'm that person, I need to stop fighting that finally, and I need to become a detective in my own life. And that's really for survivors. When I work with survivors, that's the first place I start. I recommend they begin the process of getting in touch with themselves. For someone that experiences that, I say, you know what, it probably means you need a conference room.
Yeah. You know, it's hard. You know, it's got to be hard though. Like if you've been down that path of being so severely traumatized repeatedly by so many people in your childhood, how do you get to a spot where you can actually sit down and be confident in yourself to be a detective? It's got to be hard. And also, I want to clarify because, you know, I talk to God all the time and I hear back. So am I crazy?
Yeah. No.
Okay.
You know, hopefully somebody does hear back, as they talk to the Lord. I recommend to my clients that they read through the book of Psalms because it's very, very helpful. There's a wide range of emotions within that 3,000-year-old book, or collection of songs or lyrics, quite frankly. But the best place, in my estimation, to start is you need somebody ultimately that you can talk to. Does it have to be a therapist? Not necessarily, but I think somebody that understands this. So typically that's going to be a therapist, somebody that understands the phenomenon and how to help someone through that. And quite frankly, that really is why we've created survivorsupport.net, as that can be a good place that somebody can go to begin to read. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to be added that will really be able to help someone begin to put two and two together to feel really normalized in what they've been experiencing. But they're going to have to brace for things to kind of get worse before it gets better.
Mm-hmm.
But usually what happens is by the time they are ready to, things have gotten worse. And so if it really gets bad, somebody needs to be prepared to ensure their own safety first. But if somebody can risk involving God in on the process, because I think he's the only one that can help us connect our neurons. But safety is always most important. But if they can begin to understand that there's a natural propensity to act in, to direct the anger, and that's really what's underlying the vast majority of depression and anxiety. If somebody can reframe that and think in terms of the anxiety is really adrenaline, depression is anger pushed down. Now, it can be inherited, so somebody needs to work with a doctor. But for the vast majority of the cases, it's much more productive if somebody begins to think in terms of not that they have an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, but that they are rageful. What happened? Now I can, if I'm that person, now I have something to target. I have something I can begin to ask myself, what happened? If I'm rageful, then something happened. What? And then I can become that detective in my own life.
Thank you so much, Jon Uhler, and thanks y'all for listening. We're going to have part 2 of this conversation. It's going to air next Wednesday. Jon's going to break down the differences between psychopaths, sociopaths, and narcissists. This is a really great interview to listen to, especially if you're dating. Join me at lisalandry.com. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel and you will know the moment that part 2 drops. You will also know when each new podcast drops every Womanist Wednesday. Shout out Ari Bear. I love you, boo-boo. Stay away from them psychopaths, honey. It don't end well.